Thank you everybody for joining me today while I talk about our favorite thing, LibGuides. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with introducing myself. So I am STEM and Open Science Librarian at the University of Maryland. I just started last year in June, and previously I was a graduate assistant at the Grange Engineering Library Information Center at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. That matters kind of because of like the background of me doing this project. And I am the liaison to the chemistry and biochemistry department, mathematics, chemical and biomolecular engineering, bioengineering, material science and engineering, and fire protection engineering. It's a mouthful to say all of those. So I wanted to get started with a little Menti poll to see how we feel about LibGuides. So I will pull that up in just a minute, but this has the wrong code on it. Let me get you the right code. I am sorry. It changed on me. So this, if you go to menti.com and use the code 78276478, and I'll put that in the chat as well, then you can answer the poll. Like, what's the first word that comes to mind when you think about LibGuides? Exhausting. That's resources, maintenance, busy, easy, help, one stop, underutilized, outdated, crowded, crucial. I think this is a really great example of how a lot of us feel about LibGuides, and like all together, you know, we know the purpose of LibGuides, but we also know that they can be exhausting to keep up. They are underutilized. Sometimes they require a lot of maintenance, so they sometimes are outdated. And we really wish that they were used more because we put all that effort into them. Great, thank you all for doing that. I'm going to just close the voting on that and go back to the presentation. And so just a little bit of background on this project and getting it started. So I worked on LibGuides while I was a graduate assistant at UIUC. I both created new LibGuides and I edited some existing ones to try to make them more appealing and useful. And then when I came to UMD, I of course inherited LibGuides from the previous engineering librarian and chemistry librarian, and also recently the librarian who was covering mathematics. And so I want to update them and wanted to make sure that they were, you know, useful for our students. Some of them require more updating and editing than others. Mine, for example, that I think really needs a lot of updating is my chemistry one. There's some formatting things on there, as well as some outdated information that we just really need to get up and going for students. But and then I also noticed that LibGuides are generally kind of unappealing, and there's a lot of question about their usefulness. So people, or us librarians, we really try to make them appealing. We do our best to make them useful, but then it still gets questioned a lot, and we are always wondering how useful they really are. So I wanted to kind of do this research to look into LibGuides, look into how to make them more useful for students and more appealing, and then also how to, so that way I could do that before updating my LibGuides, because if I update them first, then I'm just doing it based on what I think. And I really wanted to do it based on learning more about what might be more useful. So some key points from like literature I read is first about like the content of LibGuides. Well, this one's not about the content, but there's generally a low awareness of guides among students, which was mentioned by somebody in that Menti poll, which means that there's low use of them. If they don't know it's there, they can't use it. And then also too much information in a guide can be really overwhelming. I know I personally get overwhelmed when I'm given a lot of information at once. So I totally understand where students are coming from with this. And so because of that, they really prefer to have curated lists of resources so that are really specific to what they're looking for at their subject, at their course, whatever the LibGuide topic is on. And then the information from LibGuides is often pretty outdated and they're not being updated often enough. So having outdated information can, reduce the usefulness of them. If something's not seen as useful, then they're not going to use them. Kind of just a spiral from there about how much they get used. And then the text in the LibGuide should be informal and jargon-free. We don't want to confuse our students, and we don't want them to be frustrated and, like I said, confused while trying to look for their resources and information while doing classwork, while doing research, etc. So, and then some other key points from the literature, more about the formatting of LibGuides that I found, include that students don't like scrolling. So information, as I'm saying, calling it below the fold, might not be seen. So below that first, whatever comes up first on the screen, which of course depends on screen size. So the farther up it is, the more important it's going to seem, the more people are going to see it. But anything really below that fold, it's less likely to be seen. Students going to have to be really interested in going to find that information to bother to scroll down the page. And then students also prefer smaller chunks of text. So those large blocks of text that we see, sometimes people don't want to read them. They don't want to, or they'll just skim over it or skip it if it looks like too many words. I know there's some days that I feel like this about even just scrolling on social media. I'll feel like something is too many words, so I'll totally ignore it. It might have been important, but it was too much for me at that moment. So we really want to make it so that the information is easily accessible and readily available for the students with those smaller chunks of text. And then adding visual content really helps to break up the text. LibGuides are primarily text-based with not a lot of visuals going on, even if it's just like some images that are somewhat related, or you have something that like logos for your databases. Little things like that can really help break up the text and make it also just more engaging to look at and more appealing. And then also having interactive pieces are good to add. So if you're familiar with like the LibGuides, how they have tabbed boxes where it's a box, but then you click on the different tabs in the box, those are really good. Also gallery boxes that they have where it like will scroll, so you could put like maybe new books in there or like main resources or something, just something that it just scrolls like a gallery and shows different things. Those are good to add, maybe like videos if you're doing something instructional or trying to demonstrate how something's used and you want to include that information. That's interactive and something that students can engage with LibGuide in more. And then just overall organization preferences are highly dependent on the student. So there's not like one clear winner about what students like, whether it's tabs on the left, tabs on the top, how they want the information organized, whether it's by resource type or by research process step. It's really dependent on the individual, and so it'll really depend kind of on what your students want for what the best way for you to organize it is. Unfortunately, there's not just like one way to go ahead and do it that makes it that's really obvious. So with this project, I decided to go ahead and start by focusing on the LibGuide, on the content of my LibGuides first. There doesn't seem to be as much literature about the content of the guides compared to the format and organization. So I really wanted to focus on that. And then because organization is kind of a little ambiguous for what's going to work the best and might require some more research and really require those surveys and stuff like that, I wanted to get started on the content so at least I could get the right content onto my guides before worrying about making sure it is the prettiest or the most appealing and like organized in the best way. I also decided to look at the Big Ten Academic Alliance schools. The University of Maryland is part of the Big Ten Academic Alliance. So all these schools are pretty comparable in scope and size, including their libraries. And it's just a nice set of 14 universities, including UMD, that we can look at. I know it says Big Ten, but they grew over the years, and UMD is one of the more recent additions. So it's 14 universities that I was able to look at their guides and see what content was included in different ones. I decided to look specifically at my chemistry and mathematics LibGuides. I only cover about half of the engineering departments, and all the engineering guides are connected to each other with a template currently. And I also want to work with my colleague Sarah Weiss, who covers the rest of the engineering departments, so that way we can make sure our engineering guides are pretty cohesive and that we work together to decide if we want to keep that template, how we want to go about formatting our guides and whatnot. So I'll be doing that with her later. And then I decided to look specifically at the broad subject guides. Didn't look at any course guides and didn't look at any like really specific guides or guides that like narrowed in on different types of resources only, like patents or trademarks, or any guides that were even just more specific within a subject area. I just looked at the subject guides. So those are what I have. So I wanted to make sure I was looking at comparable guides, because that when you're comparing things, that's what matters the most, is that you're comparing apples to apples. And then I created a matrix to analyze these guides based on what I had read and then my previous knowledge of using LibGuides and what I have seen the most with LibGuides. So in the matrix, I included a few different content areas, including databases, journals, ebooks, catalog links, reference works, citation help, web resources, instructional information. I forgot to put other on here, but other was also a category, and then I had a notes category. So for the notes, I just wrote down any observations of the LibGuides or like points of interest for myself when thinking about the LibGuides later. Like if I really liked a LibGuide, I made sure to make a note of that. If I thought something was kind of sparse, I wrote that down. If there was something like confusing to me about the LibGuide, I also wrote that down, or like something I didn't understand why they organized it that way. I wrote that down since I'm going to be continuing this project and looking into more aspects of LibGuides. So, and then within the matrix, one second. Sorry. So for the matrix, I created like a rating system from 0 to 3. I used both like a qualitative and quantitative way to describe what the scores meant. So 0 meant none or 0. the qualitative was how much it felt. I started with the qualitative, trying to see like how much of these resources were available on these different LibGuides. And then I needed to quantify it because it was too ambiguous. But sometimes the qualitative was more helpful when looking at it just for like the way I was thinking about it, for specifically when it came to like web resources, citation help, and instructional information. There wasn't always like just specific numbers of resources or something that was listed. But so a 1 would be like it seemed like there was a few, or there was less than 5 resources listed. 2 had was some, so between 5 and 10, or 5 to 10, including 5 and 10. And then 3, there was a lot, so there was more than 10 resources, or just it seemed like there was a lot of information on something that was included in there. So I'm going to start going over just some of the findings I've had thus far with what research I've done so far. Excuse me. So guides vary greatly in size and scope. Some of them are 1-page brief lists of sources, and some of them are really fleshed out in multiple tabbed pages with a lot of different resources, multiple boxes, and lots of resources on different pages. And then most have been updated within the last year. So I included looking at when stuff was updated, just since that's kind of an aspect we know about LibGuides, is that they're not updated often enough. So I wanted to make sure that we were looking at that. I put an asterisk on the updated part just because the date that it says it was last updated does not indicate any extent of what updates were made. So it tells us that, yes, this guide was updated, but that update could have been a name change, a switch in who's the librarian, something like that. Something just a couple, like a link change. It could have, any small change will also trigger the same update refresh date as making more major changes. So that's why I can put an asterisk there just to keep that in mind. Personally, I think that LibGuides need to be updated at least once a year. So that's why I was like really looking to see what had happened in the last year. Because, you know, things get out of date really quickly, especially in STEM. So making sure that things are up to date like we need to have them is very important. And then a number of guides also had like an introduction page or even just box to the guide, really explaining what the guide is and what you can expect to find in that guide, which I found that really helpful. And that's something that I'm probably going to incorporate into my guides, just because I think it's a helpful way to introduce the guide and kind of go, this is what this is why we have this information here. Because not all students might know what a research guide is for before they see one and get it explained to them. So they might not go to it if they don't understand what it's for. So then I looked at the rating counts. So how many times the LibGuides were rated, when each resource was rated at each different number. So overall, I looked at 14 mathematics guides and 14 chemistry guides across the 14 universities. It does sound like there was just one of each for each university, but there actually wasn't. There was a couple that had multiple and a couple that only had like one guide. So it sounds like it was one for university for each department, but it wasn't. But so one of the interesting things I noted from this is that there was not a single LibGuide that didn't have databases listed on it. So I thought that was really interesting, and it makes sense to me. We use databases all the time. We push them, we advertise them the most. Oh, sorry, I was just gonna pop. Okay, I'll look at that later. That's a question. And then, so just some different, actually, that question I think had to do with this. The rating counts a stat within both No, so these are from what I looked at when I did, so for that I put in my matrix. So let me go back. So this rating system I gave for each of the content items included, I gave each guide a rating 0 through 3. And then this is the count of each of those ratings totaled for all 28 LibGuides that I looked at. Yeah. Okay. So just clarifying that now actually makes more sense. So this, and then I also noted that citation help, there wasn't a lot of citation help on any of the LibGuides. Everything else kind of had its own pattern for the most part. Either like reference work and web resources, there was either a lot or none for the most part. And then there wasn't very much in journals, ebooks, catalog links, etc. I'll go through a little bit more of the like specific findings in a little bit. And then I also looked at the average scores for the all of the LibGuides, and then also I separated them by mathematics and chemistry. I wanted to see if there were some differences between the department areas, and maybe think about what that might mean. So overall, of course, from the last slide, we could see that databases are the resource that are listed the most on LibGuides. Mathematics had less databases listed than chemistry. They actually had less for most of the resources than chemistry did. But it's also interesting then just to see what the numbers are, how low most of these actually averaged was what was really surprising to me. So there's that. So, but just like, so discussion about like these charts and these numbers. Like I mentioned, that databases were the only resource included in all LibGuides. They're the most utilized resource that we have in academic libraries, so it really makes sense that they're included the most on everything. And then the top 3 resources overall included were databases, reference works, and web resources. I think for me, having those reference works also makes sense because math and chemistry are both subjects that use a lot of reference works, and that they have a lot of reference works for their specific topic areas. And then web resource also makes sense because there's always a need to expand the information knowledge beyond just what the libraries have access to, especially like if students are going to be using these after graduation, or researchers need to use stuff that's outside the libraries. It just gives them more options for what's out there. Web resources often also included some of the OER information, OERs that are out there, so that way those are more findable as well. And then the bottom 3 resources that included were journals, citation help, and instructional information. For me, journals being at the bottom, like being the least included resource, was actually pretty surprising. It sounded like from the literature that journals were really important, like listing specific journals was really important, but I guess it's probably just because students especially look for articles rather than journals. They're going to use those databases rather than looking at specific journals to find what they're looking for. Maybe more advanced researchers will be looking at journals specifically, but for the majority of our users, it's probably going to be those databases to find those specific articles. And then having citation help included was kind of spotty. It was, if it was included, and kind of to how much extent. There was obviously, from that chart, we saw none that included a lot of citation help. I think that's because when there's a lot of citation help needed, it usually needs its own guide to really cover all that information. And it's not worth putting that all into a subject LibGuide, but having a little bit can be useful. And then instructional information was also interesting to see. So instructional information was typically about like how to search either like the catalog for that university or searching specific databases. There's some databases in chemistry and mathematics that are more complicated or that require some extra steps to get to. Like SciFinder always requires a registration before you can actually access it. So there's that. And it was also kind of hit or miss whether it was included and to what extent. Like there were a few that had quite a bit of instructional information and others that just had, that obviously had not, quite a few that had none, or some that had just like a spattering of it in there. So then I want, in the comparison between the mathematics and chemistry guides, I also looked at that. So there were more resources for catalog links and web resources under mathematics, and their total resource ranking was only 0.94. I think that there was more catalog links because math tends to remain more print-based than other STEM fields. It has a longer history, like time, historical pieces of publications are more utilized than other STEM fields. So there's a lot of stuff that's still in print that's used. So having those catalog links help students and researchers find those. And then for chemistry, they had more resources included overall, more resources in databases, journals, ebooks, reference works, instructional information, and the other category. And I found that generally they were more robust guides. And then their total resource ranking was an average of 1.38. So that's quite a bit higher than the resource ranking for mathematics. So chemistry is also a really specialized field when it comes to resources and reference work. It has some very specific databases and some very specific reference works that are listed on most guides, so that way, you know, the students can find those. And there are specific ones that really have information about chemicals and reactions that are really important to be able to find. Like there's like stuff about the properties, about how the reaction might occur, different things like that in some of these specific resources that aren't included in some of the more regular STEM based, like just general STEM databases. I do kind of feel like mathematics might be kind of an overlooked subject area. So I definitely want to keep that in mind when moving forward with my mathematics LibGuide. I walk past my math department every day on my way to my office in the STEM library. So I remember that the math department's there a lot, but I still feel like it might be kind of an overlooked subject area. It's sometimes relegated to an older building than a lot of the other STEM departments. So I just want to make sure that they are getting the same attention as my other departments. And then just some thoughts for continuing with this research that I found from these findings so far. I really think that the specific journals are included less often than was expected. Most of the ebook links tended to be for reference works. So there's a correlation between those two. And then there also, I feel like I need to explore what ended up being included in this other category and kind of expand on what it means. It ended up including a variety of different things like OER stuff, different websites that could be useful, professional organizations, conferences, those different things were often included in other, and I think that it could be useful to maybe expand on the list of content items that are included rather than just lumping a bunch of them into other. And then I also want to make sure to like ask students later as I move forward if there's anything missing from the guides too, like when they come to these research guides, what are they expecting? What do they feel like they're getting? What are they missing? So, and then my next steps, this is a really big project that this is really just the beginning of this project so far as I work on revamping my STEM LibGuides. So there's a lot of next steps. The first is that I want to analyze the format in addition to content for guides to see really how people are formatting their guides. And then I want to look at more institutions' guides, more than the 14 from the 28 guides I looked at from the Big 10 14 schools. So I want to get more larger schools as well, like that are similar to UMD, but also looking at some medium and small school guides to see how they do them, see if there's really any difference between school and library size for how the guides are presented and how that information is presented. And then, of course, I need to update my chemistry and mathematics guides based on the findings that I'm working on. And then I'll expand this project to working with my colleague on the engineering guides, really implementing an updating schedule. Right now, I'm thinking in between semesters is a good time. So in the summertime and then in that winter interterm are good times to kind of update those guides and make sure that they're not getting out of date too quickly. I think twice a year would be good, just because it also gives you a time to make sure that they're ready for the next semester. Use them for instruction at the beginning of semesters a lot. That could be really useful. And then I also want to go ahead and survey students about the research guides. That will be a big process in and of itself with IRB, of course. But that is where. So this is where I'm at with this project, and this is where I want to go with this project. It'll probably take me quite a while, but I'm just starting out. So I want to say thank you. My contact information is here on the screen. My email address is the best and main way to contact me. So if you don't want to ask a question today, or you have one later on, or you have suggestions, or you want me to look at your guide too because you think it's really great or you're concerned about it, any of those things I would love. I also would love suggestions, anything like that. And I am open to any questions that anybody may have, or just conversation about LibGuides.